Welcome to Table Talk, the place for deep conversations in the Geekverse. And trust me, when we tear into a subject, we go deep. I'm Heath, and I'll be your host. Each episode, I'll be talking with one or more creators, authors, illustrators, publishers, or other movers and shakers in games, TV, books, movies, or other areas of the Geekverse. Regular guests include Douglas A. Burton, the author of Faraway Bird, a multi-award-winning historical fiction novel of the Byzantine Empress Theodora. He's also the author of The Heroine's Labyrinth, an alternative story structure to the hero's journey that often occurs in stories with feminine heroes. That structural framework frequently comes up in our analysis of story. Brianna De Silva, she's the director and co-writer of The Cultists, a Lovecraftian comedy mockumentary-style web show here on YouTube, and the author of The City of Reckoning, an epic fantasy novel of political intrigue, the ethics of war, and young love. Cameron Pasha is a screenwriter, director, novelist, and was a writer and producer on the series Kings, a producer on NBC's Bionic Woman, and a co-producer and writer for Sleeper Cell. He's also written for the CW series Nikita and Roswell, New Mexico. He's been breaking news from inside Lucasfilm, Disney, and Hollywood. His analysis and commentary have become very popular on YouTube. We regularly meet to discuss and analyze stories, and when we do, we dive into graduate-level seminars on story structure and writing. Come on in and let's go deep. And when I say we're going deep, I mean you'd better bring your hard suit. Other guests have included Lou Anders, the author of the Thrones and Bones fantasy novels Once Upon a Unicorn, the creator and publisher of the Norengard RPG, and the author of Star Wars, A Pirate's Price, the book that explains why the Millennium Falcon is on the planet Batu at Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. Mark Tassin, the creator of the World of Ataltis, head of Mechanical Muse, former director of the Gen Con Writers Symposium, and the head developer of the new Cool Name RPG. Let's see, who else?
Bond. James Bond.
Well, not James Bond. Not yet. Maybe soon, though. But I have interviewed Jamie Stegmaier, the founder of Stonemaier Games, crowdfunder extraordinaire, and publisher of many hit board games like Scythe and Wingspan. Brian Colin, sculptor of the world of Revelo Monster Busts, and the creator of the vast grim dark horror RPG. Ajit George, the Dungeons & Dragons author. We talked about game writing, education, and his contribution to Van Richter's Guide to Ravenloft and the development of the Journeys to the Radiant Citadel.
I am Hela, Odin's firstborn, the commander of the legions of Asgard, the rightful heir to the throne and the goddess of death.
Well, actually, that interview got rather spicy, so I think I'd better just keep that one to myself. Kate Wilson, a YouTuber, actress, host, and prolific geek guru who's now working to make a new show dedicated to the world of tabletop gaming a reality. So buckle up and get ready for a wild ride, because it's time to explore the worlds of tabletop gaming, sci-fi, fantasy, and all of geekdom through the eyes of those who are making things happen.
Atomic batteries to power. Turbines to speed.
Roger, ready to move out.
It's time for Table Talk. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Table Talk. It is so good to have you here. I see we've got lots of people in the chat already. Good evening. James, good evening. Charlie, Sable Phoenix is here. Druden Fuzz, great to have you back. Welcome, welcome. Andrew's here. Charlie, PH, Jason, great to see everybody. Tonight, we are continuing what has been an epic week here on Table Talk. We are going to be talking with Matt Bird. He is the author of The Secrets of Story, which is, I think, basically the second book on writing that I ever picked up that I found useful. And this has definitely been a working copy of mine because it's got all kinds of notes in it, highlights, the red pen that I like to use in copies. And hey, it's not often that you get to have something on the back of your book like Matt does here that says, Matt Bird is a certifiable writing craft genius. So that's who we're going to be talking with tonight. So thank you so much for coming on tonight. Everyone, please welcome Matt Bird.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on.
I really appreciate your willingness to come here and talk to us because story writing, story structure, that has been a major part of this channel and things that we've been discussing because when it comes down to movies and television shows and the kinds of things that we all like in the Geekverse, I mean, the ability to write it well and have an excellently constructed story is the foundation of it.
Yep.
would you like to take a few minutes to tell everyone who you are? I've got some of your links up, and how you came to, well, what's going to become this analysis of story we're going to be talking about tonight. I'll put up the book.
My name is Matthew Bird. I am the author of 2 books, The Secrets of Story, Innovative Tools for Perfecting Your Fiction and Captivating Readers. When you do your first book, they don't let you choose the subtitle. They come up with the subtitle for you. And so that is why it has such a wordy and awkward subtitle, Innovative Tools for Perfecting Your Fiction and Captivating Readers. I then later published a sequel, which I don't know if you've had a chance to read, called The Secrets of Character. This time I had a little more clout. I was able to come up with the subtitle, Writing a Hero Anyone Will Love, which I was a bigger fan of. The first book, I'll just go ahead and I have been a writer in various ways for many, many years. I got a master's in screenwriting from Columbia University and then and had a career as a screenwriter, writing things that never got made, and sold some scripts to Hollywood, but ultimately decided that I preferred writing about writing, and published a blog called Cockeyed Caravan. It was originally cockeydcaravan.blogspot.com, and then eventually it turned into the book Secrets of Story, and then I renamed the blog secretsofstory.com. That is what you are seeing up on screen. Secretsofstory.com has been going strong since 2010, and eventually got turned into Secrets of Story, the book, but with lots of new material in the book, and then got turned into Secrets of Character, the book. And but I've also got a podcast with the writer. Well, I've got 2 podcasts. I've got the Secrets of Story podcast with the novelist James Kennedy, and we talk about story in all sorts of interesting ways. We have 46 episodes, as you can see. I have another podcast that might be of interest to fans of this channel, and that is Marvel Reread Club with my brother Steve Bird, where we read through the entire Marvel universe a month at a time. And
Marvel Reread Club?
Marvel Reread Club. See if you can pull that up. Secrets of Story has been going since 2016, but we've only managed to put out 46 episodes. Marvel Reread Club has only been going 2 years, but we've managed to put out, I think, 84 episodes. And it is just tremendously fun. It is by far the most entertaining thing I've ever done as a person in my various attempts to entertain America over the years is Marvel Reread Club, and we just have a tremendous amount of fun with that.
Oh, I did not know about that one. I'm glad you mentioned it. So yeah, we got that up, and I just put that link down in the comments as well.
Awesome.
So lots of stuff to lots of ways to connect with Matt as soon as you leave right here.
Oh, and I should point out also there's the Secrets of Story YouTube channel where if you want to see my points illustrated with movie clips, there are 8 videos there, and I'm sure other stuff will occur to me over the course of the evening.
Okay, I didn't know there was a YouTube channel either. So
there
actually,
it is.
We're on YouTube right here. So everyone, that one. Secrets of Story.
So there you go. Check out the Secrets of Story YouTube channel. There it is.
All right, we got the link there as well. Subscribe to the Secrets of Story right there as well. Okay, so that's so we got examples from movies. That's awesome. All right, all right, all right, Matt. We've sometimes been skeptical about writing books and stories and things like writing books or books on how to write on this channel. We've come up with a few good ones, of which yours is on the list, because it's so practical. Like, all right. And we like the books here that are the practical books. And you also even mentioned that you're irreverent in your writing style. We've come across several who are like that. So those are the kinds of books that we tend to like here. But I was looking at the very beginning where it's talking about your story, and your basically your first encounter with professional screenwriting and receiving criticism here.
Yes,
you talk about the difference between the practical reality of writing of screenwriting versus what's taught in a Master's of Fine Arts program, and I thought that, like, basically as soon as I read this passage, I was like, oh, I'm gonna like this book. Because you said here, of your Master of Fine Arts professors, you said never in a million years would they, the Master of Fine Arts professors, say, here's a popular TV show, write something as good as that. Because we were supposed to be better than the knuckle draggers writing Hollywood movies or network TV. We were supposed to be artists. As a result, I had learned the art, but not the craft. When push came to shove, I simply didn't have the tools I needed to do the job. That's a very damning passage right there.
Yes.
Can you, well, take us through that experience and what that means and how you came to this philosophy of what they don't teach?
I mean, what I was talking about, I went to Columbia, and there were a lot of good people at Columbia. I'm sure it's possible to go to Columbia and be glad you did. I did not really, but I, it's just a tremendous amount of money. First of all, it's just you spend your entire life paying it back, but then you go through that sort of like highfalutin Ivy League MFA program, and they just want to they want to convince you that you're better than everybody else, and that oh, I was just so shocked to get out and being told in that story, like, okay, here's how they introduced George Clooney in the pilot for ER. You've got to write something as good as that. And I'm like, well, I know how to write something better than that, but I don't know how to write something as good as that. I don't know how to write something like that good. And I have no idea. I know how to deconstruct the form, and I'm more than happy to do that. But how to reconstruct the form, I have no idea how to do that. And that was, and this sort of horrifying realization of like, oh, the sort of stuff I'm going to be asked to do as a professional screenwriter is the sort of stuff that I have not been at all prepared for by this program. And I think just in general, if you go to an MFA program, you're paying a fortune, and they are, in order to keep getting that money from you, they're going to tell you what you want to hear. They're going to tell you, that, they're going to tell you how wonderful you are, and they're going to tell you that, that you're, sorry, I'm, my printer sometimes makes noise. They're going to tell you that that you're, that they're just going to tell you how wonderful you are. And it's going to be fantasy camp, that you're going to be sort of living out the fantasy of being a superstar writer, instead of being told like, look, most of you probably aren't going to make it, that, that generally speaking, the average graduating class at Columbia, not a single person ever sells a script, ever even gets an agent in most graduating classes, that this is, an extremely unlikely, career for you to have, as, and never once has anybody ever said, well, we're looking to hire someone to write a screenplay, required MFA from a fancy university. Like, that has never happened. As a matter of fact, they would rather hear that you don't have that. They would rather hear that you have been to the School of Hard Knocks, that you've been, as I say, they would rather hear that you've been in prison. That's what they would love to hear, is that you've been in prison. It's like, oh my God, you were actually in prison and now you're a screenwriter? Like, that's the most amazing thing. Tell us about that. Like, yes, we want to,
it's a life experience.
Or that's life experience. Like, you're not like some dude who's been hiding in an ivory tower for the last, 16 years of his life. You're someone who has actually been out in the world. And so it's, of all the different sort of degrees that you can get, it is the most damning degree for the actual profession that you are applying to, because literally no one has ever in the history of mankind ever said, we require you to have an MFA in order to do this job.
Well, so it also sounds like, a particular attitude toward something like television. We talked about the difference between Maxwell Alexander Drake is big on the difference between literary fiction and genre fiction. And he's like, genre fiction is everything you'd ever read for entertainment, and literary fiction is everything that you would only read if you're being forced to by a professor or a teacher. And a sort of disdain for something like genre fiction that you seem to say is conveyed there. It seems shocking that like something is good as something on television, but then again, the things that are on television or in movies can be, not always, but can be the stuff that impacts us the most and our culture.
Well, I say at one point on the blog that it took me a long time to realize like that it took me a long time to realize that drama is how it is and genre is how it feels. So you can either write about what it was actually like for you in high school or what it was actually like for you at your first job, and you can write a drama about it, or you can say, well, this is what it felt like to be in high school, and that's genre. So if you're writing about, here was the time I got my heart broken in high school, you can write a drama. If you're writing about, here's what it felt like to get my heart broken in high school, then you can write Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And you can write like, well, it felt like, my boyfriend turned into a monster and the world was going to end because he lost his soul when I had sex with him. And then if you want to write about, okay, well, this is how it felt, then that's genre. And genre is equally valid form of art to drama. And they're both, the one is how it is and one is how it felt. And that's two, equally wonderful ways to write.
You wrote in here as well, how dare, it's talking about the professors there, how dare I imply there was a right way or a wrong way to write? Students were free to follow their pure unadulterated visions, and nobody had any right to interfere with that process. And that's when you talk about feeling like you were just there to have money wringed out of you.
Yes.
And with the promise of genius.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's correct. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, but the right and wrong ways, a lot of people have talked about here, whether that's story structure or even just actually the writing of individual sentences. What's better and what's worse? It seems like people who are actually publishing stuff in genre do think that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I was saying there is that sometimes, we would say like, okay, someone would present their work and be like, okay, how can I, give me some tweaks to revise this? And I would say like, well, you might want to reconceive it to a certain extent. And I was told like, no, you can never, ever tell somebody to reconceive their project. It's our job is to make something the ultimate expression of itself. And then if you're implying that, someone should reconceive something like, that's backing down, you can't ever back down. You've got to always stand your horses, hold your ground, something like that. I'm mixing up my metaphors. But and I'm like, no, sometimes you have to reconceive something. You have to reconceive a project. I say in my book that don't revise, rewrite. That so much of the problem with MFA programs is you're suggesting tweaks to each other. You're suggesting like, oh, here's how you might want to revise this a little bit and, make little slight tweaks to make this, even better than it already is. And to say, we were not being told like, okay, this is not revision class. This is rewriting class. We're going to rewrite these things from the ground up and deal with an audience. I mean, that's what I talk about in the book. I begin the book by saying that the number one way to know how to write is to imagine you're on an airplane and you sit next to someone on the airplane and they will imagine you're getting on an airplane and you have filled up your iPhone with podcasts that you want to listen to, and you're about to put in the earbuds when the person next to you is like, hi, how are you? Let me tell you about my day. And you're like, oh God, the person next to me on the plane wants to tell me about their day. And how that story is almost always going to be terrible. It's almost always going to be something you're not interested in hearing, but it could be great. And very rarely you will meet someone on a plane who will tell you an interesting story about their day, but it's very, very hard because you don't want to hear it. You want to listen to your podcast. And that's the way to write, is to imagine you're telling the story to someone who doesn't want to hear it. I think that one of the most poisonous things a writer can do is they're like, oh, I'm telling my story for those people who this book is going to be their favorite book, and I'm writing their favorite book for them, and they're going to approach it with so much love. And you have to realize, like, people, there's a lot of stories out there already, and you are trying to convince people to love your story who are not generally inclined to love your story. People who are going to be like, ugh, I'm working my way through these submissions to my production company, or I'm working my way through these submissions to this writing contest, or I'm working my way through the slush pile at this publishing company, and this is probably going to suck. And you have to overcome people who are thinking this is probably going to suck. And you have to write much, much better to overcome that prejudice to overcome, to reach someone who thinks your work is probably going to suck than you would if you're imagining writing it for someone who it's like, oh, this is their favorite novel that they've read for the 20th time. And you have to imagine, okay, if someone is thinking this is probably going to suck, if someone doesn't want to hear it, then how should I tell the story? Should I talk about the 5 different things I did today and the without any focus or direction? Should I say, well, wait, actually, before I tell you about my day, let me tell you about my childhood and about some, a few things that happened to me when I was very small, and that might impact what I tell you about today. Like, no, suddenly everything becomes much clearer when you realize this. You're like, okay, I do not want to have that flashback to my childhood. I do not want to talk about 5 unrelated things that happened to me today. I want to tell a quick, focused, probably ironic story about something that happened that is going to win over this person who would rather be listening to their podcast. And that is and as I say, like, that's all you need to know about writing story, is that's how you write a story, is write the story that would win you over in that situation. But if you want to read some more, read the rest of my book. And that's what I then go on to do.
I think that's an excellent. I made note of that. So that was that extra line. Write it as though to someone who is expecting this is going to suck. I love that. I'm gonna, when I go back to writing tomorrow, I'm gonna have that in mind. It's gonna be up here. Actually, some of what you said there before we leave that subject about college, I mean, could be a common condemnation across a lot of higher education today. That, okay, you spend a lot of time there, you spend a lot of money there, and then do you get out and are you actually capable of doing what it is that you thought you were going to be able to do? And it seems like that's often no today, unfortunately. But in the context of writing, so where do you go to learn how to write? If you want to do that.
I think that you write. You just, starting from the earliest time, as soon as you decide you want to be a writer, you have to write. You have to put your stuff out there, often for free. You have to, start a blog. I just can't imagine not starting a blog. I started my career having a blog where you have to write every day and get your stuff out in the world. I guess I didn't. First, I had my original career, which had nothing to do with that, and would have just horrified. I would have been horrified at the notion of putting any writing out there for free. But you've got to submit to every contest. You've got to get your writing before everyone who will possibly take a look at your writing. You have to get to know other writers. You have to join online writing groups. You have to form communities. My wife got her start as a novelist she was a librarian and started a blog for her library, and then started Kidlit Drink Nights, where in New York City, she would rent out a bar, and then she would invite everyone who was the biggest agents and authors and publishers in town out for drinks. And then when she finally started her career as a picture book writer and novelist, she got to interview agents. She got to choose from all the top agents in town which one she wanted to represent her, because they all owed her for the connections she had helped make for them, and for they were all just fans of hers. They all just liked her because she had been a very likable person. That is so much better. My wife did not get an MFA. She's a more successful writer. That is the heart, just making, just being out there, just, because it's so easy to hide when you're getting an MFA. It's so easy to hide from the world. And, putting yourself out there, like my co-host on the Secrets of Story podcast, James Kennedy, he doesn't have an MFA. He's a very successful novelist. And he, oh my God, going to his parties here in Chicago, it is every conceivable writer in the world that he has befriended over the years here in Chicago and gotten to know, I find that, taking classes that are not for MFA, take a much cheaper community college class, take an improv class. James is always, do stuff that actually frees you up as a writer instead of earns you a degree. James is always yelling at me for never having taken improv classes. He's like, you're in Chicago, you've got access to the world's greatest improv. And he talks about how much taking improv classes helped him as a writer. But it's so tricky. It's so hard to I mean, it's so hard for anybody to make a period, but I don't think an MFA is the best way to do it.
Okay, so after you made that realization, then you started basically your own writing course, your own writing education, which ultimately became this book, if I understand the timeline correctly. And I think you can tell me whether or not this is a good way to describe what you did overall, because I think it is, at least how I took it when I read through this book, is that you were like, okay, look, we've got a lot of information on what makes a good story, because especially in the area of screenplay, we got a whole bunch of movies that have been made over the past 100 years, or however, a little bit more than that, however long it's been, and we can just look at that as a corpus of stories. We can find out what resonated with audiences, what didn't, because we know like which one of these movies did well, which ones did not do well, and then we just look at this and we analyze that and we figure out what's working and why.
Yeah.
Is that basically what you did?
Well, what I did was when I had my screenwriting career and it was going okay. I got cancer and lost sort of a year of my life to that, and then realized that my managers had sort of stopped calling me back while I was under, and that that I had been pretty dissatisfied with my career as it was. And then it was 2010 and blogs were huge. So I'm like, I'm going to start a blog where I watch a great underrated movie and write it up every day. And then I got to the point where I'd been doing that for like 90 days and had done 90 movies. And I'm like, God, this is killing me. I've got to start doing something so that I can not spend several hours a day blogging. And then I was like, I'll just start doing writing advice. And I had thought a lot about writing advice, and I had learned a lot. I had learned some stuff at school, and then I had learned a lot through my career after school, a lot of it that turned out to contradict what I had learned in school. And then I had also learned a lot. I'd learned a lot from doing the underrated movies. I had learned a lot through, forcing myself to rewatch one of my favorite underrated movies every day for 90 days. And it just all sort of came together. So much of it, especially my second book, Secrets of Character, was sort of based on a 5-year program I did on the blog of just specifically rewatching the first 15 minutes of movies and rereading the first 10 pages of my favorite novels and the first 10 pages of graphic novels and the first 15 minutes of TV pilots and the first 10 pages of memoirs, and then sort of focusing like a laser on what gets us to fall in love with the character right away. Because so much, I realized that one of the major realizations I had in my first book is that people don't fall in love with your plot. People don't really care about your plot. They're interested in their concept. The concept is the only thing that's going to get them through the door. They've got to think you have an interesting concept. They have to think you have an interesting hook. But then as soon as they come through the door, as soon as they arrive to discuss your book, then they have no interest in your concept. They could care less if this is, a hitman who can see the future. They're like, okay, you hooked me to get me in the door with Hitman who can see the future. Now I don't care about that at all. Now I just want to know if this is a character who I'm going to fall in love with. That's all they care about. And as soon as you can't hook people that way. You can't go like, oh, it's an exceptionally well-written story with a character you love. That's not a way to sell your work. You sell the work going, it's a hitman who can see the future. Then as soon as they're there, they're like, okay, now give me a character I can fall in love with and give it to me in the first 10 pages. I'm only going to read 10 pages of your novel. And if you haven't hooked me and if you haven't made me fall in love with the character, I'm going to stop reading. People generally don't walk out of movies after 10 minutes, but they very frequently will give up on a movie after 10 minutes if they don't like the character. Certainly people will turn off a TV show after 10 minutes. And realizing that, it was sort of a gradual process of writing the first book and sort of realizing how important character was. And then realizing that if I was going to do a follow-up, I focus on 7 different disciplines. I focus on 7 different crafts within the discipline of writing in the first book. And character was one of them. But then I realized that's like the thing. And that's what I should focus on in my second book.
I wonder if I went back and thought about some of the different movies that I really like that are outside of a genre that I typically watch. I always like to pay attention to those movies because, I guess that's the concept idea that, oh, here's a science fiction thing. Here's a fantasy thing. Okay, those areas are the kinds of things that I read or watch a lot of. But then there are other things like we talk about Tombstone, which is a Western, which is not something I typically watch, but like that one is an amazing film. So that's one of my top favorites. I wonder how important the characters are. Probably a lot.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, like that's a great, you can watch a great film and you're like, I don't even like this kind of movie. Like, I'm not interested in this concept. I'm not interested in this. How did I even wind up watching this? It was an accident. This was a mistake, or everybody told me it was great. I mean, the ultimate example of this is Barbie. I mean, like trying to explain to people like, oh, I just saw the Barbie movie and it's really great. And then, you would tell people like, oh, I just watched the Barbie movie. It's really great. And, people, if they were like, what the hell? What the hell are you even saying? Like, how can a Barbie movie be great? It's like, no, I'm not interested in that. I'm not the sort of person who wants there to be more movies made about plastic toys. I'm not the sort of person who is inherently interested when you tell me there's been a movie made about a plastic toy. But I am the sort of person who it's like, well, everybody's saying it's really great, so I'll go see it. And then you go see it and you're like, oh, the fact that you don't care about Barbie, the fact that you don't care about plastic toys, the fact that you actively want there to be fewer movies like this made doesn't matter as soon as the movie begins. And you're like, oh, this is a fucking great movie. This is sorry, do we curse here?
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
This is a great movie. Like, it doesn't matter. Within 10 minutes, the fact that you were actively opposed to the existence of this movie doesn't matter because you fall in love with the character.
Well, Druden Fuzz had said that love, I think the secret ingredient is love, up very at the beginning where we started. But you're right. Okay, the secret ingredient is love. Love the character.
Yes.
Doug actually says on that point, which I think is great. Doug for $4.99, who is frequently on the show here. Doug, thank you so much, Doug. Says, Matt, what are your 2 or 3 film recommendations that have great characters?
Well, I keep my favorite films here by the desk. So let me see, what are some, here we go. The top 3 on the pile. These are 3 with great characters. Sideways, I think it's a fascinating movie because it's about a loser, and those are generally the hardest people to write about. We're hardwired to hate losers and not care about them no matter what. And yet this is a loser who you totally fall in love with right away. And you never lose it. Speaking of Greta Gerwig, Lady Bird, one of the best movies of recent years. Talk about a movie where you believe, care, and invest right away, which is what I talk about in my book, Secrets of Character, how you need to first believe in the reality of a character, then care about the circumstances of the character, then invest in the hero to solve this problem. And this is one of the all-time great examples of that. And let's see, here's The Babadook, another great female-directed movie where you totally fall in love with the hero and the thing. Those are the top 3 movies on the pile next to me right now.
I haven't seen any of those. So
you haven't seen any of those? Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, you were on a geek show. You should certainly see The Babadook. The Babadook, one of the all-time great horror movies.
All right, I've got them. All right. They'll go on the list. We're trying to get through a lot of things. Like James is saying, love that film. Doug says Lady Bird is great. And actually, Brianna talked about that one. All right. So, well, yep. All right. So that needs to go on the list. All right. Well, so you talked about this book is structured, going to the Secrets of Story. You had rules for writing for strangers, and then later, basically a checklist of a bunch of stuff. But I thought we could talk about a couple of these rules for writing for strangers. Let's say, let's go to this one right here. Your number 6 in this was that it's very hard to get. I'll quote it exactly. Number 6, it's very hard to get audiences to care about any hero because they're afraid of getting hurt.
Yes.
What does that mean, and how do we fix that in our own writing?
I talk about how, like I was saying before, when you go to a movie, you're very rarely going to walk out of that movie. You're very rarely going to go this movie, you're essentially locked in. You're not actually locked in. The doors are openable, but you're essentially locked in. You're not going to get up and leave, but you are going to give up on the movie pretty quickly and pretty irrevocably, because you know that what a movie or a book or a TV show or memoir or a graphic novel is asking you to do, first and foremost, is it's asking you to care. It's asking you to go like, I care about the story. I care about this person, really a person, not a story. And I feel for this person. I am feeling empathy and sympathy, and I am for this person. And that is a vulnerable position to be in. You are being asked to care. And in real life, if you care about someone and realize, I care about this person more than they care about themselves, if you've been in this situation romantically, where you're like, I care about this person more than they care about themselves, or I care about this person, but they do not have what it takes to make it in life. They are someone who is not going to be able to take care of themselves, or I care about this person and they are someone who is going to hurt me, who does not care about me, then that is painful. It is painful to care about someone who is not worth caring about. And people know that going in. They know that going into your story. And if they are afraid of being hurt, they have had bad stories in the past. They have had bad relationships with other characters. And they know that, I was talking about, it's the most amazing thing about Sideways is that I talk about how there had been 2 other movies that had come out around the same time that were also about loser characters. And I got up, I've talked about this in my own podcast, but for about 20 years of my life, I would get up on Friday morning, I would check the newspaper, and I would see what the independent films were that were opening at my local art house. And then I would see which ones were well reviewed, and I would go out and see one that weekend. I would go to my local art house and see an art movie every weekend. And then I had one weekend where I was living in New York City, where the art house movies were, $17 a pop. And I said, there's 2 well-reviewed movies. Let me go see them both this weekend. And one of them was called Big Fan, and the other one was called Greenberg. And it was very much in vogue at the time to do movies about sort of antisocial loser type characters. And these were both movies about antisocial loser type characters. And I found these characters so hard to care about and so unrewarding to care about. Like, it did not do me any good to care about these characters. They didn't care about themselves. That I decided, I sort of didn't consciously decide, but I basically decided I am done with the entire concept of independent film. I have spent the last 20 years of my life getting up on Friday morning, checking the paper, and then going to see an independent film. And I am done seeing American independent films. This is what films have been like for too long, and I am done with them. And I essentially never set foot in an art house again. Nowadays, all the art houses are going out of business. But so these were 2 movies in which I was being asked to care about characters who were not worth caring about. And it was so painful. It was so painful for me sitting in these theaters. And, my wife and I had spent, $40 buying these tickets, $80 buying the tickets to the 2 movies. And that was money we were never going to see again. And this was the 4 hours I'd spent watching these movies for 4 hours I was never going to get back. That's what made it so amazing when Sideways came out, and was, just as much, even more so to a certain extent, of a character who is extremely hard to care about. But you can write it. You can write anything. Anything anyone ever tells you can't be done, it can be done. You can write, and it's funny because then Barbie, which I was talking about being so good, was co-written by Noah Baumbach, who wrote Greenberg. And so, so don't give up on anybody. Don't give up on a creator, because sometimes they will turn around and surprise you. But it was so painful for me to watch those 2 movies that I completely gave up on an entire sector of the entertainment economy in order to protect myself from watching more movies like that. And then, but then, so it's just, yeah, I guess that's what I had to say.
Okay. you've got to get someone to care about the character, but also you had this idea as well that sometimes that may not necessarily be the character that you're intending now, or that a reader or a watcher is going to adopt and identify with one character to be their hero, and hopefully that's going to be the protagonist, but that they're going to identify with a hero to carry them through the story. And you gave a great example of Satan in Paradise Lost being an unanticipated character that people started to identify with.
Well, he was the active hero. He wasn't a hero. He was the anti-hero, but he was the most active character. He's the character who's driving the story. And, John Milton, the blind 17th century poet, talked about, or 18th century, I guess, talked about how, like, people are reading my epic poem and they're preferring Satan to Adam. They're preferring Satan to God, Satan to Jesus, Satan to Adam. And that, like, people will choose their own hero. I talk about in the book the movie Superman Returns, where Superman is this, morose, mopey, lump. And he's just this terrible human being who is doing nobody any good. And then at one point he gets attacked by Lex Luthor or something, and he is drowning in the ocean. And then Lois Lane's other boyfriend, Lois Lane's other suitor, is like this tremendously happy, peppy, successful guy played by James Marsden. And he finds out Superman is drowning out in the ocean and can't be bothered to save himself. And James Marsden is like, I have what are those things called? I have a waterboat, a waterplane, seaplane.
A hydroplane?
I have a seaplane out parked in front of my house. I will hop in the seaplane and I'll fly out in the middle of the ocean and I'll save Superman from drowning in the ocean. And I'm like, that's the hero. That's the hero of this story. That is certainly who Lois should end up with. I don't think anybody saw Superman Returns and wanted Lois to end up with Superman. I think everybody watching that movie is like, look at this guy. You've got the world's most wonderful guy. Go with that guy. Don't go with Superman.
That's one of the passages that I've highlighted and I've in your book, and that's come back and helped me as I've been writing stories. And there's something that's not right with the story. It's not as good as it could be. What's wrong with it? And I'll go back and I'll start thumbing through the different books, of which yours is one, and look at the different things I've highlighted and see if I can come up with it. And your passages on active protagonists are so important. Like anytime it's like, oh yeah, maybe the problem is that the main character is not actually as active as they should be. And whenever I go back and rewrite scenes and make them more active in scenes, it improves the story.
Yes. Yeah. That's writing 101. Coming up with, we're going to ignore the hero if we see someone who's doing more to drive the story forward. We're going to root for that person.
We talk quite a bit about structure right here. And you have a passage here, number 11. Well, actually, I tell you what, let's do 10 and 11 together. I'll say 10. You said your story is not about your hero's life. It's about your hero's problem. And that story structure is just a list of the steps and missteps most people go through when trying to solve a large problem in real life.
Yes. So, whenever gurus are like, I've come up with the perfect story structure and it applies to all movies, they always insist, this applies to all movies, every single story ever done. And then you always get some joker who's like, well, what about Pulp Fiction? Pulp Fiction doesn't, doesn't go on Campbell's hero's journey. This is a completely movie that just blows every story writing theory out of the water. And I'm like, look, when I talk about structure, I'm talking about the series of steps and missteps someone goes on when solving a large problem. And when I talk about structure, I'm talking about in stories that are about solving a large problem. Pulp Fiction and so many great films, and not just movies that are as wild as that, but even a movie like Boogie Nights or a movie like, there's all sorts of great films that are not about the solving of a large problem. Then they're not going to have that structure. They're not going to, that's not what structure is. Structure is not something that is imposed on every story ever told. Structure is if you are telling the story of someone trying to solve a large problem, which most stories are about, not all great stories, certainly, but most stories are about the solving a large problem, then they're going to generally they're going to hit sort of the 14 steps that most people hit when trying to solve a large problem. So you're talking about not the structure of great literature, which can be anything, which can mean anything. You're talking about the structure of human nature. And that is why stories, that is where Joseph Hero's journey comes from. That is where, the save the cat beat sheet comes from. That's where these various structures come from. And even then, there's a million different ways of making out structure. You should, let me, do I have a way of sending this to you? I guess.
Look over in the private chat. Look over on the far left, far right, of the window, private chat. If you need to send me a link, I can bring it up on the screen.
Okay, let me go ahead and do. I did a Great Guru Showdown. Oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Here, let me. I took everybody's structure and I laid them all on top of each other. And just to show that there's a million different ways. I mean, now again, all of these only apply to stories that are about the solving a large problem. And so go ahead and click on that purple and blue box.
Oh, right here. Oh, perfect. I'll put the link in the comments as well.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of different ways of people saying different story structure, but generally speaking, these are all for, stories about solving large problems. So for me, I've got Act 1, an old problem intensifies, a false philosophy, a dangerous opportunity appears, a false goal is formed, quarter point, commit to opportunity. Act 2, Part 1, try it the easy way, assumptions unquestioned, having fun, midpoint disaster, loss of safe space. Act 2, Part 2, try it the hard way, assumptions questioned, painful lessons, 3 quarter points, spiritual crisis, hard-won power. Act 3, true philosophy, true goal, resolve conflict, resolve problem. But you've got all sorts of people, including some people who a lot of people know, like Joseph Campbell or Blake Snyder, and then some of my favorite little-known gurus, like Jules Selbo, who wrote a really great book. I love this book. I've been meaning to do an episode of my podcast about it because I'm not even sure it's still in print. But Screenplay from Idea to Successful Script, I think it's an underrated story guru guide. But anyway, yes. So, but the important thing is that anybody who is teaching you structure, you have to remember that, first of all, that there's a million different ways to do it and they can all work. And second of all, that this is only going to apply to stories about solving a large problem. But then you have to remember that almost every great story, I wouldn't even say that, but I would say a majority of the great stories are about the solving of large problems.
When you said something about human nature here. So when you're talking about where do these things come from, we've talked about how sometimes we write these things. Sometimes the word's been accidentally, sometimes it's been accidentally, sometimes it's been intrinsic, whatever. These things come up. So when you're talking about structuring a story for in this case, solving a large problem, do you think these things then come from something psychological and that it's not an accident that we see these reoccurring themes or reoccurring elements of story?
I mean, I should say that obviously human nature is a very controversial topic, and a lot of people are like, oh, when you say human nature, are you talking about, white, straight, cis, Western human nature? And, there was a great book that everyone should read called Craft in the World by Matthew Salesses about, sort of interrogating structures of power and how they're furthered by talking about human nature and talking about story. But if you, sorry, could you bring that back up?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But I talk about how, really, I sort of toss in again at the bottom there. I talk about, sort of the story gurus, and then I talk about me with my general points, and then specific things for each, specific things for specific genres. But then at the bottom, I talk about, like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talking about the stages of grief, or Abraham Maslow talking about the hierarchy of needs, and how these are, it's not just me and Joseph Campbell and Blake Snyder who are trying to figure out the steps of solving a large problem. Grief is a large problem. And if you follow the steps of solving the problem of grief as laid out by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, they are going to line up with screenplay format in general and a lot of great stories in particular. A lot of times you're going to read a story and you're being like, oh, okay, this is following what Kubler-Ross said is the steps most people go through in the order they go through them while trying to deal with the problem of grief. Maslow talks about the problem of survival and, how working your way up his hierarchy of needs from food and shelter to security to love and belonging, friends, self-esteem, achievement, then justice, creativity, and acceptance at the higher level. That this is, and again, this is very problematic when you're like, okay, how can you say that there's one sort of human nature? But this is something that every great thinker has been dealing with since the beginning of mankind. And what tends to happen is that, people all over the world have found Kubler-Ross, even though she is coming from just one culture, she is coming from just one way of thinking, that people have found her steps of grief helpful, very helpful in helping them solve their problems. That there are thinkers throughout mankind who have tried to speak to human nature, tried to speak to something universal, and have been beloved and accepted everywhere. I just watched, talk about all-time great movies, I just watched Fiddler on the Roof with my kids, and I was telling them the story about how it's one of the most popular musicals in Japan, and at one point, someone was in Japan watching it and was really enjoying it, and then was talking to the person in Japan, and was going like, oh, I've been in Fiddler on the Roof in America. And they're like, they do Fiddler on the Roof in America? And he's like, yes, it's an American story. It's from America. And he's like, but it's such a Japanese story. How could you do Fiddler on the Roof in America? You would have to be Japanese to understand Fiddler on the Roof. And that, that's what happens with really great stories, like a really great story like Fiddler on the Roof. It seems, it's on the one hand could not be more about one culture in one time, the Jewish world in the Ukraine in 1905, but it then was created within this completely different culture of, New York City in the 1960s, and then speaks to, Japan in the 1980s, whenever this story happened. And because there is something universal in human nature that connects these three wildly different times and places. And that is, I think, our job as writers, is to tap into human nature, to describe human nature, to understand human nature, and yes, understand it's a problematic concept, but still try to work with it and still try to find something universal.
Well, if you, I guess that's the hypothesis under which the humanities operate. I guess that if there is such thing as studying the humanities, then that would sort of assume, that's working under the hypothesis, there is something that connects us through space and time that is the human experience.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the story that is furthest apart from me in terms of distance is Gilgamesh. That's the oldest piece of literature that we still have, that we still read. And, there cannot be more time separating me from Gilgamesh more than any other story ever written. But Gilgamesh, I'm right here. It hits me right here. It's like, this is human nature. This is true. This is, speaking to me. This is a story that was written, 4,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago. I don't know when Gilgamesh was written, but sometime between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. And it is, it feels like a story that is written today. It feels like a story that speaks directly to me. And that is the goal of writing. The goal of writing is to, reach out across space and time. And that is a story that does so.
When you're looking at all of these, this is a very interesting chart here. Actually, I see there's some different. We could zero in on the middle, the beginning, the middle, and the end.
That's just breaking it down.
We love charts like this here on Table Talk. But when you were breaking this down and overlapping these, we often talk about the difference between, if any, for any particular person who we're discussing this with, we often talk about the difference between structure and formula. So what, in your opinion, is the difference between structure and formula, and how do you keep from being formulaic, if that's a bad thing?
Yeah, it's a very bad thing. And you do not want to be formulaic. And the last thing you should do, like I talk about, like most story gurus say, okay, at around a quarter of the way into the story, the hero should commit. And the hero should like be on the fence. It's okay to be on the fence for the first quarter of the story. And then, some people would say at the end of Act 1, or, I just say at the first quarter of the story because I like to, reach out to people who might not necessarily believe in 3-act structure, that the hero should commit. But that doesn't mean you should have a scene. The last thing you should do is go like, oh, I don't have a moment where the hero commits. I don't have a moment where they say, damn it, I'm going to do it. And that moment is missing from my story, so I have to add it. Well, that's not true. If you look at a movie like Some Like It Hot, they're like, hey, we could dress up like women and, join an all-girls band. And, the Joe is like, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Then you cut to they're wobbling in heels and they're walking down the train to get on the train and go join the girls' band. There is no scene of them going like, let's do it. Let's go ahead and commit to this. We just skip right over the commit scene. And that's true in like half the movies, in like half the story. So the worst thing you could do is to go like, well, I'm not hitting every beat. But if you can skip the beat, skip it. If you are not doing a paint by numbers formula, you are trying to write something that is not formulaic. And any rule that you can possibly break. That the reason to know why all the rules are there is to know how to break them and when to break them. And you can break any rule in the world if you know you're breaking it. If, like Picasso knew how to paint normal paintings. He was a great painter. He could paint beautiful, normal paintings. And then he said, but I'm going to choose not to. I'm going to choose to do cubist paintings. And if you know how to write something that hits every beat and then choose, but I'm going to go ahead and write something that is completely, just completely mind-blowing or completely strange, then that is great. If okay, I could have written it normally, I could have written it formulaically, I could have written it in a way that is going to give everybody what they want, but I'm not gonna, then that's the best kind of writing. So the last thing you should be is formulaic. The last thing you should go is like, well, other stories have done it, so I should do it too. And I need to, and these are the 14 beats, and this beat is not on the right page. The worst is, they've got like calculators online for like, Save the Cat writes a novel where they're like, okay, on page 21.2, you should have the hero state the philosophy of the story. And I'm like, first of all, I don't think the hero should know the philosophy of the story on page 21.2, but also like, giving someone an exact page number of where they should put something is just criminal malpractice. That's the last thing anybody should ever be doing. And, I need to hit this thing in this place. Like the whole purpose of a book like mine or any book on writing is to go like, my story is not having the effect that I thought it was going to have. I wrote a story. I thought it was good. Nobody liked it. Nobody loved it. I don't know what they expected that I didn't do. And then you read a book like mine and you're like, oh, that's what they expected that I didn't do. That's what stories tend to do, that people then formed an expectation of that's what good stories will do. And then when they were at my story and I didn't do it, not knowing that I wasn't doing it, that then they were like, we don't like your story, Matt. We don't like your story that didn't hit these beats we expected it to hit or hoped it would hit or wanted it to hit and isn't satisfying our expectations. And I talk about in my book how that fulfilling expectations is great, but what's even better is setting expectations. I talk about how the easiest thing to do as a writer is to defy expectations. The easiest thing to do is go like, oh, you thought that like, guess what? I just killed off the hero on page 30. Boy, that blows your mind, doesn't it? That's something that upsets your expectations. But upsetting expectations is one thing, but setting expectations is something else. To say, like, I'm going to set an expectation, and then I'm going to upset the expectation, and then I'm going to reset the expectation. And knowing how to set, upset, and reset expectations, you can write anything in the world you want to write if you know how to reset expectations, if you know how to create a desire. If you can create a desire, I mean, it's like love. It's like anything in life. If you can, create the desire, then you have total power. And that is, the understanding tone, which is one of the chapters in my book, understanding how to use genre, understanding how to use various tone setting tools is, if you can, every time you see something that it's like, why is that popular? Like, that's not the sort of thing people should like. It's almost always because they are resetting people's expectations and they're creating a demand for something that people didn't know they wanted.
I love, like Sable Phoenix says, I'm going to quote this right here from your book because I think this is so important because I had this on the notes. But like Sable Phoenix says, I just had Luke throw away his dad's lightsaber. I bet that upsets your expectations, huh? Right, that kind of thing. That's easy to put in there. Moments like that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that, if we're talking about The Last Jedi, it's funny. I had the one of the most contentious episodes I ever recorded of my podcast, the Good Story podcast. We got in such a fight over Last Jedi that I never released the episode because
really?
It was just too contentious. It was painful to listen to. But like there was,
that could have been YouTube gold.
I would say that it could have totally worked to have Luke throw away to have Luke throw away the lightsaber. I think that totally could have worked. As a matter, and you sort of think that's going to happen at the end of Force Awakens. You're like, does he want this lightsaber? That's the end note of the Force Awakens. It's like he's being offered this lightsaber and he doesn't seem very happy about being handed it. And then I think it totally worked fine in Last Jedi to have him throw it away. I think it did not work at all to go like, that whole mystery we set up in the first movie of whose Rey's parents are. Well, they were nobodies. And I'm like, well, that is what I don't like about defying expectations, because you were defying the expectations of the internet. You're not defying the expectations. You are saying like, oh, the first movie set up this mystery, but it wasn't a mystery for her. She wasn't assuming that her dad was probably Luke Skywalker. She wasn't assuming that she had the secret of the hidden birth. It was all about, that was all about trying to interact with the expectations of the audience in a way where, like, there's nothing worse. There's nothing worse than when you're watching something and they're like, oh, the creator of this work is going to put himself in opposition to you, the reader, and go like, I am going to fight you. I'm going to fight what you want. And and I felt like that was what Last Jedi did too much. I felt like Last Jedi was, and also it was sort of going like, oh, you saw the first trilogy and you saw that we redeemed. It's funny, I just saw Adam Driver being interviewed on SmartList, and he was like, the whole original idea for Kylo Ren was that he was going to go on the opposite journey of Darth Vader, and Darth Vader like started off as the most evil possible person in existence and ended up being redeemed. And they were going to start off with Kylo Ren really not being that bad, and then get worse and worse and worse throughout the three movies. And, so it starts off where it seems like he's going to be redeemed. And then by the end, he is going to be, you're going to realize like, this is the worst possible person. And of course they didn't do that. Of course they redeemed him in the third movie, because ultimately that sequel trilogy was more about recreating the first trilogy than it was about answering it, than it was about moving the story on to a new level. But I thought that was, and then Adam Driver was basically apologizing in this interview, going like, yeah, sorry, we didn't do what we set out to do. We didn't do what we promised that we would do, which is, sort of that moment where Kylo Ren kills Han, kills his father, was supposed to be, that was supposed to be the redemption moment that he then rejects. But inevitably, they felt they needed to redeem him in the final story, which I didn't think worked.
Yeah. So you said, so I'll give the quote here on this subject. First and foremost, audiences don't want you to defy expectations. They want you to create them, because you hear so much about, subverting expectations and things like that. And then you say, it turns out that people don't actually want to say, I had no idea that was going to happen. In fact, they're often delighted to say, I knew that was going to happen. People love to get to know your characters, and they feel clever when they can predict those characters' reactions. Defying expectations is easy. Creating expectations is hard.
Yes.
I love that.
Yes. And that's a big part of my second book, is about how to create expectations. One of the first things I say in my second book is that one of the secrets of great writing is to be repetitive. How you might think like, that's, generally speaking in life, if somebody tells you, Matt, you're repetitive, then that's probably not a compliment. But great writing is repetitive. Great writing hits beats over and over and over again. I talk about rolling the rock uphill, that the more you roll a rock uphill, the more energy you're creating. You're creating kinetic energy every time you push a rock further uphill. And if you are willing to push it uphill over and over and over again for hours, and then you let it go, that then you're releasing a tremendous amount of energy. And that I talk about, the first book I talk about in Secrets of Character is one of my favorite books, Little Women. And I point out like 5 different places in the first 10 pages where they go specifically through what each of the girls does. And now it's time to set the table. Well, here's what each of the 4 girls does when it's time to set the table. Now they're talking about what they're going to buy for Christmas. Here's what each of the 4 girls says. And already by the end of page 10, you're like, oh, that's so Amy. Oh, that's Amy again. Oh, listen to Amy being like Amy. And we love that. We love to say, oh, that's so Amy. Oh my God. And then Louisa May Alcott rolls that rock up for 200 pages. And then she lets it go at the end. And then the characters change and they grow. And you're like, oh, Amy is not being like Amy now. Amy has changed. And it's so wonderful. And that is what we want from stories, is that, just defying expectations right away, defying expectations before you've earned the right to defy expectations is the worst thing a writer can do. And setting expectations is so much better.
Yeah, and I also think that's an excellent point as well that you brought up, that when people are talking about defying expectations, it's whose expectations are you defying? And if it's something that you're setting up inside the story, that's one thing. If it's the audience that's completely interacting outside of the story, it's another. Like, I remember George R.R. Martin was saying that early on he was seeing on some websites, like forums, like internet forums, that people were going through his books and they had figured out Jon Snow's parentage.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, no, wait a minute, what do I do? So, I've set all that up in the story. You're saying that people are going to go, man, I was right. When it comes out, and like, I knew that was it because listen, I saw all the clues. I set this up. You're saying that's what people want. People don't want him to go, wait a minute. They've figured this out. So let me just completely defy everything that I put in the books and completely change it up. And I think that's a really important point.
Oh yeah. Well, obviously the secret there is don't write your series so damn slow. Do not put out a book every 15 years so that people have the time to pour back over. Like, it took people years and years. I mean, if he had just written that series at a normal pace, then he would have finished it before people had time to go back and reread the first 5 books so many times that, he had put in very subtle clues as to what Jon Snow's parentage was. And he did exactly what you're supposed to do. It was there. He had planted it, but he had planted it very deep, and it was going to take a long time to spring up, and nobody would have gotten in. But then he said, okay, I'm not going to publish book 6, reread books 1 through 5 over and over and over again. And then, because it's the internet, then people, as soon as someone figured it out, because it was beautifully set up, because it's like, oh, suddenly it all makes sense, which is what you always want to have when you have any sort of reveal in the story. You want to have people go like, oh, I hadn't occurred to me, but yes, that makes sense. Then as soon as people figured it out, everyone was like, oh, okay, that's definitely it. This fan theory is correct. And the worst thing you can do, like in the early days of the internet, there were, they did like a big DC Comics crossover where it was going to turn out that, they were all fighting some villain, and they're like, oh, one of this villain is one of us in the future, some hero. And I forget whether someone just guessed it online or the actual answer leaked out some way, but it leaked out in the very early days of the internet, and then they changed it at the last second to have it be a character that made no sense for it to be that character. And they're like, aha, but we did surprise you, because, we had, instead of having the character who we had subtly set up to be the character, we had a character who would make no sense at all for that character to be the character. And then, an aha, surprise. And people are like, no, this sucks. And you've just ruined a perfectly good character.
I think that's excellent. I think it's an excellent point. I think that's so important in the world, especially today. Maybe we don't hear about it quite as much right now, but man, certainly over the years, defying expectations or subverting expectations was all over the place. I want to ask you another question about structure and formula as a follow-up, because with regard to structure and formula, let's talk about when formula could potentially work, which includes an example from your book here. Because when I think of formula, like if somebody were asked me to distinguish the two, story structure is all the things that we talk about when we talk about the hero's journey or the heroine's labyrinth, also here on this channel, and all of those kinds of things. But when I think about formula, I think of something different. And I do think there are some very formulaic stories out there, some of which have been extremely successful. And I often think about TV shows when I think about something being formulaic. And I think about, like, Home Improvement is an example that I use a lot. If you watch an episode of Home Improvement, you're going to have a scene with, where he's on his show, the show within a show. You're going to have a scene where he goes and talks to Wilson, and you're going to have, a scene with a reconciliation with the wife. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers was very formulaic. Like, we're going to start.
Oh, I mean, any show, if you analyze it closely enough, becomes formulaic. Any show, it's certainly, like, yeah, you show me enough episodes of any show, I'm going like, okay, here's, I mean, TV is much more TV is by far the most formulaic type of writing. It is, TV, it used to be you had 22 episodes a year, and and they were all written by different people, and you had to farm it out, and you had the pilot, which basically would establish, the sort of things that happened in every one of these stories, and it would farm out. And great TV, you don't care that it's formulaic. You don't care that you're going to hit generally all these things. Occasionally there's going to be an episode that completely breaks the formula, and you're going to love it, and that's going to be your favorite episode. But the fact that most weeks, House, you watch a show like House, and there's going to be 10 beats that every episode of House hits. I was talking about this in my blog at one point, going like, he's like, House is like, I can't figure out what's wrong with this. I can't figure out what's wrong with the patient. He's going to die. Hey, they forgot to put the lemon in my iced tea. Lemon? That's it. It's scurvy. And then he runs across the campus to go ahead and solve the case. But we can absolutely love it. Again, the difference is something having a formula is fine. Something being formulaic, when we say something is formulaic, that means that it is feeling the need to hit the formula when it doesn't need to hit the formula. It's feeling the need to going like, oh, can we do one episode of House where he doesn't suddenly have something from outside his world, have him realize what the nature of the disease is, that, people are so sick of that. Do we have to do that every time? Well, yes, we have to. We are slaves to the formula. This is, we are trying to write something formulaic. Well, that's the worst, and it's certainly the worst for people who are trying to make it as writers. This is one of the differences. They used to be that if you want to make it as a TV writer, you would write a spec script, you would watch a bunch of episodes of House, which was hard to do because it wasn't streaming, and you had to record all these episodes on VHS, and then you would watch them and rewatch them and rewatch them until you realize the formula, and then you would write a typical episode of House, or you would write a typical episode of Cheers, or you would write a typical episode of Seinfeld, or you write a typical episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and then you would submit that to agents, and agents would then use that to submit you for shows when they were trying to get to a writing gig on that show. Well, eventually they realized, we don't care if you can do that. For one thing, writers' rooms don't really exist to the degree to which they used to. And the whole idea of, can you write a typical episode of existing show, that was all TV writers were doing, from 1960 to 2015, was you had to write your spec script of an existing show. Well, around 2015, they said, yeah, that's fine if you can do that, but we don't care. We don't want to see your spec script anymore. We want to see your spec pilots. If you're trying to make it as a writer, then you have to be more original than someone who is working as a working writer. You have to, instead of writing a, episode 12 of a, season 3, episode 12 of a formulaic show, you have to only write the first episode of a show, only write the pilot of a show. And that's what we want to see you do, because that's what we want to see. And then we might hire you to write, season 8, episode 6 of Rick and Morty, based on you having written a pilot that had the same vibe as Rick and Morty. And that change is because they were sick and tired of reading these formulaic scripts. They do not want you to be formulaic, even if they're going to want you to eventually hire you to fit something that fits a certain formula, which they will inevitably, if you're lucky, if you have a successful career as a TV staff writer. But at some point they just decided, even though this is the job we're hiring you for, we can't stand this anymore. We can't stand to read these scripts anymore. Don't send them to us.
All right. I've got one more here. Is this number 12? No, number 13. There were 13. And this is about how to create meaning in stories, which is of supreme importance right here. So you write here that irony is the source of all meaning.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
If you are on that airplane and that person is telling you a story about their day and it turns out to be a great story, it's going to be a great story because it's ironic. Because the one thing that they were trying not to do is the one thing that they should have done. Because the one thing that, that they had invested all of their efforts into stopping turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to them. Because it's an ironic story. And that is a meaningful story. The only way that story the person is telling you on the airplane is going to be a good story is if it's an ironic story. And if it's not ironic, it's going to be meaningless. All non-ironic stories are meaningless. All stories that are meaningful because of ironic reasons. And I talk about how, though this is not the same as sarcastic. This is not, sometimes people say, like, generally speaking, if someone's like, hey, you should read my novel, it's really ironic, then I'm going to be like, oh, no, thanks. Because when people say irony, they tend to mean sarcasm, or sometimes they mean defying expectations. They mean it's something that is very meta or something that, breaks down the form. And I'm going to be like, oh, no, thanks. I don't want to read your super meta novel, or I don't want to read your super sarcastic novel. But if they've read my book and they say it's a really ironic, hey, I read your book, Secrets of Story, and I just read a really ironic story, I'm going to be like, oh, great. Then you're using irony the way I believe in it. And I'm going to love it because all great stories are ironic. So I highly recommend the Secrets of the Story YouTube channel video on irony. And I specifically go through it. And there was also a really good episode of the Secrets of the Story podcast on irony. In the episode of the Secrets of the Story podcast, I talk about irony in 3 very different types of stories. I talk about irony in Casablanca. I talk about irony in Blazing Saddles. And I talk about irony in Mulan. The video is specifically about Mulan. And the reason why I focus on irony in Mulan is that I think this notion people have of irony, when you say, oh, this is a story with a lot of irony, then people are like, if they think irony means meta or they think it means sarcastic, they're like, oh, not the sort of thing you would find in a children's story, because children are pre-ironic. There's this sense, that children, they don't have any sense of irony. They don't have any sense of, expectations about the world that they expect to see defied. that they are just forming their expectations about the world. They don't believe in irony. Well, if you watch Mulan, which is a great children's movie, then everything is so ironic. That movie could not be more dripping in irony. From the very basic concept of the greatest warrior in ancient China is a woman, to all of these specific things of, I'm going to make a man out of you. Let's get down to business to defeat the Huns. Did they send me daughters when I asked for sons? Well, yes, they did send you daughters when you asked for sons. And, I'm going to take you, weak, pathetic young men, and I'm going to make a man out of you. Well, one of them actually does have to be turned a man to. And then the soldiers are saying to this woman warrior, oh, what do we want? We want a girl worth fighting for. Well, it turns out that they're actually talking to a girl worth fighting for, they are going to have to fall into battle. And in fact, the only way that they win the final battle in Mulan is she has to infiltrate the palace, and they have to dress up as concubines to infiltrate the palace. So she has to make a woman out of all of her fellow soldiers in order to infiltrate the palace at the end. This is a story that is just suffused in irony. So I go through in the YouTube video, and I talk about 14 different types of irony in Mulan. And that is why it is a meaningful story. That is why it is a great story. And then if you like that, then move on to the Secrets of Story podcast episode on irony. And I talk about how, then you have a story like Blazing Saddles, which is a meta story, is a story that is interrogating the form, but is using irony in a lot of traditional ways, but it's also using it in a way that interrogates form. And then I talk about a story like Casablanca, which is a sarcastic story. It is about a story about a very sarcastic hero. So you might call this guy ironic if you met him. That's the last thing you want, is to meet somebody and going oh, I just met somebody, he's really ironic. It's I don't want to meet that guy. This is someone who is going to be super sarcastic. But I talk about how irony, I talk about the 14 types of irony and those 3 different types of story on the podcast episode. And I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to learn more about that.
Well, can you give us another example with how about we use Star Wars as an example, because everyone knows that one. So
now I'm I could look up on the podcast. I did another thing I do on secretsofstory.com is I go through 30 movies and I ask all 122 of my questions of all 30 movies. And I go ahead and so I did interrogate 14 different types of irony of Star Wars
in each
as
one.
I went through it. Yes.
Okay.
So
okay.
That is but I would have to
okay. Then I won't
irony of Star Wars, and instantly I'm
that's all right. Okay, no problem. So I'll let you, as we round out here. We just briefly went over the first part, which was what about writing, or what the writing, and then the 13 rules of writing for strangers. But then, do you want to talk about how the rest of the story is structured if somebody comes and picks this up with part 2? Because part 2 is the ultimate story checklist, which you just mentioned. So what is that? Let me
go ahead and say, suddenly all of these ironies of Star Wars are occurring to me. They rescue a princess who instantly takes over the rescue and is telling them everything they're doing wrong. And, yes, you just escaped. They let you escape. They're following you. The princess who they go to rescue is 10 times better than they are at everything. And, of course, one of the first lines in that movie is, he's he says, Sir Luke, C-3PO calls him Sir Luke, and he's like, no, just Luke. I can never be a knight. So the thing he's could not be further away from me. And so, anyway, okay, sorry, let me go on. So yes, so the way this book is structured is it's first got 13 laws of, you have been going through the laws of writing, the sort of 13 laws that I found ran all 122 of these questions, the ultimate story checklist. Then you can spend the rest of the book, most of the rest of the book, asking 122 questions of your story. And the last thing you should do is answer yes to all 122 questions. Do not do that. You will write a terrible story if you answer yes to all 122 questions. However, you should answer yes to most of them. And they're all questions about, am I doing this? Am I doing this? And, they're all basically about, am I meeting this expectation that people have of what a great story does? And hopefully I am. Does the dialogue capture the jargon and tradecraft of the profession and or setting is something from my dialogue chapter. From the tone chapter, I ask, are there characters whose situations suggest possible fates for the hero? And so I go through all 122 questions of this. So recently what I've done on secretsofstory.com is I revisited all of these 122 questions with its own blog post, and I then talked about how the 30 movies that I've examined all answered that question. And then I go through subsequent pieces I've written over the years where I've talked about other movies, and I've talked about how they exemplify that question or how they upset that question, how they, I have some pieces called rulebook case file, like, oh, here's a case file that fits this rule. And then I have some pieces called straying from the party line, where I'm going like, here's someone who completely breaks this rule. So for instance, we recently did an episode of the Secrets of Story podcast talking about how one of my rules is that your story should reflect your research into the time and place you're writing about. And that's a good general rule for writing. Yes, your story should be authentic to the true facts of this time and place you're writing about. But then I talk about Blue Velvet. Blue Velvet is set in North Carolina in 1986, a small town in North Carolina in 1986. Well, it's completely inauthentic. Nobody has a North Carolina accent. Nobody is, there's no sense at all of what life was actually like in small towns in North Carolina. It is instead a movie about the idea of living in America and the idea of story and the idea, it's a movie that is, trying to tell this iconic archetypal story that is in no way trying to tell a real, gritty, lived-in, authentic story. And it's great. It's a masterpiece. It is a story that, that is why when I go back and I broke down these 122 questions, you click on Expanded Ultimate Story Checklist in the sidebar, and then you can click on all 122 questions. And if you want to break something, I talk about in my second book, The Secrets of Character, the opening of the book talks about how I will get emails from people. And the email will say, I bought your book, Secrets of the Story. I love it, but I can't answer yes to question 116. So could I get your permission to not follow that one? Could I get a special dispensation from you to say no to question 116? And I'm like, yes, you can. Do not, this is, I talk about how that's the last thing I ever wanted is to set things that people had to do. And I talk about how Pixar, when they are giving advice to writers, they say tools, not rules. They say we're trying to give you tools. We're not trying to give you rules. We're not trying to tell you things you have to do. We're trying to tell you something that you might find useful in achieving what you want to achieve. And that is very much for me as well. I had not heard that. So I did not put that in my first book, but I put it front and center in my second book, that the whole purpose of these 122 questions in the Ultimate Story Checklist is to have tools, not rules. And to realize like, oh, that's going to help me achieve what I want to achieve.
All right. Well, I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I have really enjoyed talking to you. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for having me on. I think we got a lot of great information here, and also advanced our conversation on story structure and storytelling, because it is such an important part of the Geekverse. And I thought it was really important to have you on, because we talk about your book quite a bit. Your book comes up quite a bit. So let's send everybody to, so secretsofstory.com. So is that the best place to know what's going on with you?
Yeah. If you look there on secretsofstory.com, first of all, it'll say, get my book. It'll send you to Amazon to get both books. And then you can click on Secret Story Podcast. You can find those 42 episodes. You can click on Marvel Reread Club. You can find those 83 episodes. But then you can see that it says if you scroll down a little bit there, you can see it says the Expanded Ultimate. No, don't scroll down that far. Wait, stop. Wait, oh, wait. The Expanded Ultimate Story Checklist. well,
Oh,
you'll
right here.
actually-
I was
yeah.
looking for that earlier. There we go.
So then if you scroll down, you can scroll down and click on any one of these.
Does something inside the hero have a particularly volatile reaction to the challenge?
Yes,
Boom.
click on that, and then you'll see this is the post from the book, and then scroll down, and then this one, it doesn't have any case files or strength and prey line, but it does have how each of the movies I looked at answers this one. And you can see that, like, for the second one on the list there, it said it only slightly, and The Fugitive, not really. So Alien, this is only slightly true of that story, and it's a great story. The Fugitive, it's not really true of that story. And then this is a way to know that, oh, I can break this rule, and it's not going to be, the Harrison Ford in The Fugitive is not a very volatile person. He does not explode. He does not, like I said, they rolled the rock uphill for a long time. So at the end, he is, of course, you have to have Harrison Ford point at the camera and shake his finger at some point. But most characters in stories are volatile. And then, even Martin Luther King, I talk about, he's not a very volatile guy on the surface, but we sense quiet fury lurking under the surface of the performance. But you can write a great story in which your hero is not volatile. And it's something where if there's something wrong with your story, and it's like, why aren't people reacting the way I thought I did? You can go like, oh, this character isn't volatile enough. This character doesn't have enough going on under the surface. But if you then go like, oh, I know that that's what people are going to expect of me, and I'm going to defy that. I'm going to, I know that expectation is out there, but I'm going to defy that expectation. That's fine.
All right. I know a lot of people on the channel are going to want to check this out. So yes, that's an important link here. Let me just get over the direct link to the story checklist. Story checklist. Oh, we had a super chat come in. Sable Phoenix says, I have a theory that separate from themes and separate from dramatic question, there's a deeper concept and a really good story that I've come to call the core interrogation. That's going to be, there's going to be a follow-up to that too. It's a question. We'll see what he comes in with. But anyway, we were saying the Secrets of Story blog, that's the place to be day to day on what's coming in. Okay.
I haven't, I decided to take a break from the blog to write a novel. So I wrote a novel in January. Yesterday was the last day of January, and I typed to the end on my novel.
I saw that was coming out on Facebook. You said something about the novel, or no, actually, I think it was actually on Secrets of Story. I think it was right here. You were like, the novel is done, and I'm coming on tonight. Yep. Hi guys, the draft of the novel is almost done.
Yep. And then I finished it. I finished it yesterday. So, and now I was gonna then go ahead and spend February. Another thing I've been doing on the blog is 37 Days of Shakespeare, where I go through and I talk about each of Shakespeare's plays. And I was going to do that, but I'm like, no, I've got to do my year-end movie list. So, I think I'm going to hold off on the Shakespeare a little bit longer and do my year-end movie list. And then I'm going to take February off from my novel and let it marinate a little bit. As I say in my book, Secrets of the Story, that, don't just walk away from your story if you're trying to revise it, or if you need to rewrite it. Don't just walk away from your story. Don't just leave it in a drawer for a week. Leave it out in the backyard where it can get rained on and stepped on. And then see if there's, and then let it be totally sullied, and then see if there's anything left that's worthwhile about it once you go back to it. So that's what I'm doing right now with my novel. And then I'm going to, but I was going to take some time off to do some more Shakespeare, which I've been greatly enjoying. But instead, I think I will do my year-end movie list soon.
Let's see what the Sable says for $10, and then we will wrap up here. I have a theory that separate from themes and separate from the dramatic question, there's a deeper concept and really good stories that I've come to call the core interrogation. It's a question that the story is investigating and will offer an answer to, maybe be embodied in the characters themselves, but is never explicitly stated. Do you think that's accurate, or have any thoughts on that?
I think that everybody who seriously is grappling with story is going to come up with their own thing that no one else has ever realized about story before. It's the sort of, that sounds like a great idea. That sounds like something that would be, I don't think it can be, it doesn't sound like an idea that can be summed up very well into text messages, but it sounds like an idea that would be fascinating. And every time I read a book on story, I'm like, I do this for a living, and I've never thought of that. That's a great way of thinking of stories. And that sounds like another great way of thinking of stories that I would need to hear more about.
All right. Thank you so much, Matt. I really enjoyed it. I think everyone in the chat has too, and I appreciate everybody who's been here in the chat. You guys always make the show so much better. That's why we do this live with the conversations and so forth. We will be talking about airing on this channel at 1 o'clock on Sunday. My discussion with Doug and Brianna on Sleeping Beauty and Maleficent. So that comes out on Sunday. And then I will see everybody also tomorrow on the Heath Geekverse channel for the morning grind. So, all right, everybody. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you, everybody. Go forth, be creative. I will see you later.